I think one of the things we've worked on all semester is talking about American literature in its cultural context. And the thing about the cultural context of the United States across a whole century is that it's vast. I mean, how in the world do you even begin? Well, I think beginning is really easy. You connect one text to another text. And then from there you start to build up the context. And so the small group exercise I have for you is about making connections. The first connection is about connecting one text by one author to another text by another author, Douglas and Fuller. The other is about connecting two texts by the same author. And the third exercise is about connecting the views, the world views, the opinions of one author to another author's text. And what we'll do is you'll spend about 10, 15 minutes on those, and then we're going to have kind of a larger group discussion that might get into some of the bigger issues, like why are any of these texts still important? Why would we bother to read Frederick Douglass not arguing against slavery now, when slavery is clearly not an issue? Why would this still matter to us? And I think that's a legitimate question to ask. And then about 8 o'clock or so, we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and we'll review for final. The first one is about connecting Fuller and Douglass. As you know, the United States, according to its founding documents like the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, is a nation founded on principles. The principles of independence, freedom, or liberty, and equality, or what's sometimes called justice for all. The founding fathers said this, our founding documents say this, and Fuller and Douglass are fully in support of freedom and equality, but they lay into the United States. They're very critical. Why? If everybody is all in agreement about how important these principles are, where's the disagreement? So that's your first task. The second one is about connecting Lazarus's poem Echoes to her later poem, The New Ezekiel. Jamie, do you have one of these? Mm-hmm. Okay. Echoes was a poem that she never published. It got published after she died. It was just left in a manuscript book of hers. And she probably wrote it in the late 1870s. And just a few years later, and in that poem, as you'll remember, she talks about her elf music, describing her own poetry, I think, in terms of this little quiet, womanly voice in a cave with a lake floor. And then in the New Ezekiel, she's asking the dead to rise from their graves to create a new land. And I think the context for that is that she's calling for the creation of the nation-state of Israel, which would happen in 1948, 60, 70 years after this poem was written. And so, putting these two poems together, which is the real Lazarus? Is it the kind of poetic, artistic, quiet little woman who would write echoes, or the loud, politically powerful poet who would call for the recreation of the nation of Israel? This is the political movement known as Zionism, which would become a big deal about 1895 up through the 20th century. Here, before this even happens, is Lazarus is calling for the creation of a new Jewish state in Palestine. So which of these is the real Lazarus? You've read a lot of her work, you decide. Or you might decide there's a problem with this either-or kind of question. But which of these is the real Lazarus, or why would somebody who was interested in small, quiet songs start writing global political poems? And the third one is just, I want you to imagine that you're one of these authors, Bronson Alcott, or Thoreau, or Emerson, or James, or Lazarus, or Louisa May Alcott. If you're this person, how do you read Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking? What's the poem about? Is it a poem about death? Is it a poem about nature? Is it a poem about art and how to become a poet? Is it a poem about childhood? If you're one of these authors, how do you read Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking? And there's some questions there. And then I want you to shift gears right at the end and ask yourself, well, how do I see the poem? How do I see the poem in a way that might be different from the way Bronson Alcott might be good? I'm going to divide you into about groups of 3. I just want you to pick one of these tasks and do it. If you finish, go on to the next one. Sound good? So just get in your group and choose your task and just get right to it. Try to get to an answer as quickly as possible. Lazarus is one of these just a persona and not the real Lazarus. How do you understand the contradiction between these two?
Okay.
Sound good?
Yep. I don't really think that it's contradictory so much. As he said, these poems are what 5 years apart. In the Echoes poem, she's going to be 5 years younger. She's going to be less mature. Maybe she even knows, she doesn't know as much about her Jewish heritage as she does later. In this poem, you know, she's 5 years more mature, and she's had time to think about what her people have gone through.
Which one is she?
Maybe she got this. Yeah, right. Yeah. Maybe she's heard more stories from her family, and maybe not just.
Let's start with Douglas and Fuller. You know, both these are two kind of classic political texts. You know, one arguing for women's rights, the other arguing for the abolitionist cause. Their primary principles here are freedom and equality. Well, that's what the United States stands for. So why are they so darn critical of the United States? Who wants to start? What? Yeah, this side of the room did it. Start with Levi.
Well, it's the definition of who is included in all is essentially the argument is over, because back in that time a lot of people thought that the all only included white men, which is why Douglas had a problem with it, because slaves weren't included and they were slaves still in bondage. And
So why should a slave celebrate white people's independence, their liberty?
And then Fuller, because women didn't have the right to vote, and when they got married, if they did own property, the property went automatically became their husband. And it's essentially because who's governed over by that statement.
Doesn't Douglas seem pretty anti-American in that 4th of July speech? You know, what is the 4th of July to a slave? I mean, he's powerful. He's so angry that he's not even going to make the case anymore. He refuses to argue. And that's a good example of that rhetorical thing that they call paralipsis, where you tell people, you know, I'm not going to go into detail about Levi's drunkenness, you know, and you bring it up and everybody knows Levi's a drunk even though you said, and so he does the same thing. I'm not going to tell you all the reasons why you should be against slavery, and then he lists them, right? The torture, the brutality, the kidnapping, etc. But he's really angry, and so he's refusing to celebrate the 4th of July. Isn't this kind of getting at the heart of Americanism and patriotism to kind of be so critical of a great holiday?
Well, in doing that, all he's saying is what 4th of July is celebrating freedom, but the slaves weren't granted freedom on the 4th of July when America was granted independence from England, so why should they celebrate it as their Independence Day, essentially?
Other thoughts about what's going on here with these texts? Why are they so very critical? And does Fuller seem that critical, or is her rhetoric different? Or are the definitions of freedom here with Douglas and Fuller different than the definitions that appear in the Declaration of Independence or appear in other American literary texts.
Fuller seems more concerned with like justifying why women should have these rights, and because she goes on and gives catalog upon catalog of examples of how women have intellect and how women are justified. She gives biblical accounts, and she tries really hard to pinpoint and say women are just capable, women support men. That's how men get to the positions they are. So I think she's much more invested in demonstrating that we're women and we have capabilities.
Okay. Fuller's big rhetorical strategy is to show off how smart she is, and she is. She's probably the smartest of the transcendentalists. She knew several languages. She got homeschooled with a brilliant father for years and years and years. But her rhetorical strategy here is to show off all her learning. Douglas's is to be so angry and exasperated that he's not even going to make the case for why we should end slavery anymore, because if you aren't good enough or smart enough to understand why slavery is a crime, then he doesn't even want to talk to you. Why? Why do they choose these rhetorical strategies? Why is Fuller kind of showing off all her knowledge, being super learned? Her editor, you know this, right? Her editor sends it back to her and says, this is kind of hard, this great lawsuit essay. Don't you want to kind of clean this up? And she goes, no, I think my readers should kind of come up to me. Why is she doing that to her readers? You know, how does that help her case? How does Douglas's anger help his? Make sense?
Well, because she's a woman, she's kind of proving her point through giving the speech in general. I mean, like, because she can show off her intelligence, that proves her point that women are intelligent. And with Douglas, I think he used to be a slave, and so he feels like he can speak from that viewpoint, and he tells the slave story, but he also separates himself from other Americans. So you get this completely different, like, outreach viewpoint. And they just work in two different ways, I think.
It is. He does a lot of you and me, you know, distancing himself from his audience. You ever?
I was thinking about women at that time weren't college educated, and it seems like Fuller has to almost prove her intelligence to get in there and argue. She's making a case. I am worthy of making this argument by getting all this, literature in there that doesn't really belong in the argument. Where Douglas doesn't have to do that. He just argues.
Why doesn't he have to do that?
Hasn't he already done it? In the narratives, he's proven himself in that manner. So I think at this point, he's like, oh, you don't get it, then whatever.
I mean, I think that's a really good point. You know, you think about this in the early 1850s. The anti-slavery movement's been going strong since about 1830, 31. Douglas has been doing this full-time for over a decade. He's exasperated that no progress seems to be made.
That, you mentioned the laws that are against educating African Americans and all, against any acts, and there are no acts just like that against livestock, which some people consider the African Americans as. So that's just proof that everybody knows that African Americans are people.
Do you remember this argument? It's really clever, which is that if slaves can be taken to a court of law for this whole laundry list of crimes in Virginia, well, the law must assume that they're human beings, because you don't take your dog to court, right? You don't take your cattle to court. And so I thought it was very clever.
I was just coming back to the differences between Fuller and Douglas.
What? Yeah.
And I think you have to also take into account the method of delivery, because this is a speech, and Frederick Douglass is going to want to be emoting and getting his audience like feeling the same emotions that he is, whereas Fuller is writing this intellectual piece and people are going to read it and have more time to think about it. So I think that accounts for some of the differences in their rhetorical styles.
Right. That if Fuller were to have delivered her great lawsuit as a lecture, people would have fallen asleep, right? Mm-hmm. They would have. It's too long and complicated. And what's that example about? I mean, you have to sit there and kind of study it to follow her argument. Douglas, though, I mean, it's right there. It's very visceral. These are not poems. These are not plays. These are not stories. Is there anything literary about these two texts? Or what are they doing in a literature class? Let's bring that one on here.
One of the responsibilities of literature is to portray what the culture of the time was like. So that's exactly what they were doing. They were writing these things down and saying these things to make it known to everyone what they were going through at the time. So she was writing her essay to be able to put everyone else in her place, everyone that wasn't a woman in her place, so that they could understand. And then she was probably aware that people would be reading it later on as well, and they would be able to see what it used to be like.
So part of it, they're both trying to capture something that's going on in the culture, but
yeah.
Other speeches can do that.
I think they also both are excellent examples of the proof that there's power in language and what literature can do. And I think they did both different approaches, one an essay, one a speech, but just the power that they had in writing in education.
What specifically do you think is powerful about either one that has to do with the language or the rhetoric or the
Douglas uses some really powerful images. Like I'm thinking of the example where he paints this picture of the women and children being sold, and they're walking along, leaving bloody footprints and the whip cracks, and it's just like this brilliant picture of slavery and how horrible it is. I think that really works in his favor.
Yeah, and as I think I mentioned before, his irony. He doesn't say what he means, and I think what he conveys there is anger, right? That the gap between I'm not going to tell you how awful slavery is, and then he lists it. He expresses his frustration with that. I think also the sarcasm and the you-me rhetoric, all of that conveys a certain intensity. Fuller. What seems literary about Fuller?
What page is Fuller on? 383.
Yeah. I think it's the dense set of allusion, right? It's the constant referencing of other literary sources. It's stories as well that are kind of embedded in there. Of these two texts, which do you think is the most important now? I mean, they were both important in their time, right? You know, Fuller's making this contribution to the women's movement, Douglas to the anti-slavery movement. Are they still important now? Why?
There still is no equality. There's still not an equal rights amendment. Women still don't make as much money as men do. There's still inequality. Like this election is going to be pretty important because we have the opportunity to see the first African-American male president.
Or the first woman president?
Yeah, and in so many years, they've all been white guys, old white men. That seems to me like there's still prejudice and racism, and no one else has been able to get their foot in the door to even get that high until just now. It's a long time.
I was just going to say, as long as there's people who are silenced, there's always some room for Douglas and Fuller. I mean, when there's someone who doesn't have a voice, they offer that voice.
The kind of speaking out against injustices. And their injustices, the injustices now might be different than they were in the 19th century, but still we have role models. Though race and gender seem to be two of the big divisions now, as in the 19th century. I was reading this really cool book by Daniel Walker Howe. He's a historian. He wrote this history of America from the early 19th century to the Mexican War, 1848. Just won the Pulitzer Prize for history. And in it, he says that Fuller is the most important and the most modern of the transcendentalists. She's not the best writer. I mean, that's going to be Emerson or Thoreau, I think. But he says the most important and the most modern. Does that make any sense to anybody? That's okay. I swung that one on you, but
Well, I think you have the illusions. I think that can definitely be, that's a modernist favorite tactic, is just to grab illusion after illusion and put them side by side. So we can start seeing her to do that. I think she pieces it together a little bit more coherently than most modernist writers do. But if that's a start, if that's somehow her assertion or kind of her big push, it's just that this is all my evidence, you deal with it, then in that sense I can see modernism starting to happen in that sense.
I just had a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
Modernist or modern?
Yeah, I noticed that shift too. He says modern in the sense that, not in the sense of an artistic style, but in the sense of contemporary, changing the speed of life. I think it has something to do, I think part of his case is about the fact that it's something that I'm not sure is clear in the Great Lawsuit itself, which is, does she see men and women as essentially different or not? This is page 418, for example.
Yeah, that's what she said, there's no such thing as a holy female woman or a holy male man. I think she thinks that, like, there are parts of us in each other. So I don't think that she sees this great division between gender roles.
Exactly. This is like Women's Studies 101 or Feminism 101 in the 20th century, which is that the differences between men and women are mostly socially, culturally constructed. This is to quote Simone de Beauvoir, the famous 20th century French feminist, but that you're not born a woman, you become one. You're educated, socialized into that. 19th century doesn't believe this at all. They believe that women have these innate abilities. And the transcendentalists are all about innate abilities. But here on page 14 at the bottom, she does kind of suggest that masculine and feminine aren't things that belong to men or to women, that they're qualities, and that she, I think, identifies as a very masculine woman and sees Shelley and Channing and some others that she mentions as very feminine men. Kind of an anti-essentialist view of gender. Does that make her modern? Shantae would say yes.
That makes her extremely modern. In Latino literature, we're studying that. What this group of writers is doing is arguing for a more protean sense of gender, where we're not so caught up in female behavior or male behavior. It's just behavior. And so I think that would make her very contemporary.
Yeah. No, and I think it changes your... Were you going to say something, Levi?
I was just going to say, yeah, it's like discussions of like Sedgwick and Butler nowadays.
Yes. It is. I mean, and if this idea that we associate with 20th century feminism is actually begins here with Margaret Fuller in a way, this is important to us now. I mean, this is an idea that started in the 19th century and is still with us. Okay, let's go to number 2. We picked just 2 kind of different poems, by Lazarus. One an 1870s poem, one an 1880 poem. They're different. They're very different. One seems to be about art and the poet's voice and being a woman, and it suggests that she can't write and she doesn't want to write heroics, epics, but that she wants to do little elf music, to use her phrase. And then the new Ezekiel, she's calling the dead from their graves to create a new Jewish homeland, I think. I think that's, I know it's veiled under metaphor and symbol there, but I think that's what she wants politically. Which is the real Lazarus? Which is the...
We had 2 different interpretations. One was that she's gaining between the echoes and the new Ezekiel. She's gaining a bit of confidence. She's developing as a person in both knowledge and age, or whatever it may be, and confidence. She has more knowledge of the Jewish culture. She's been writing for, I mean, obviously she's been writing quite some time before Echoes, but she's been writing a little bit more. I think she's getting a bit of understanding. And then we had the other interpretation that Echoes is just hidden under a veil of humility, basically. She's saying, this is my conservative side, this is what's supposed to be, my woman's side, and I'm hiding under this, but actually the new Ezekiel is me. This is what I actually want to have happen. This is my more readily available self.
Okay, so there's two interpretations there. One is the idea this is just development and growth. She thinks this one thing in the late 70s, she learns more, she discovers things, she grows as a poet, she breaks out of the sonnet form in some ways, and she has other things to say. Another view is that Echoes is always already it's a persona. It's just it's a role she's playing. It's not really her. She's playing the humble female role. Other views about other interpretations? Do both of those make sense, or would you want to add to those, or?
Well, we said that it's a shift in what's going on in the times. Like Echoes and a lot of her earlier work is a testament to her fantastic education, and a lot of her work was translations, and she spoke all these different languages. And then as time progresses, she realizes, all the atrocities that the Jews are facing, and that her family brought. Were some of the original people who brought Judaism to the United States, but they weren't really, they didn't practice, or they did make paper on her, and I did some background research. It said that they weren't, they would go occasionally, but they weren't about by any means.
Right.
And so, she's learning about all these things going on, the atrocities that the Jews are facing, and I think that kind of made her realize, this could be me and somebody needs to stand up for them.
So the first poem reflects her kind of education, her, I guess it's a kind of ivory tower, but the protected, highly educated world that she lived in. The second one it gives us insight into a politically changed Lazarus. And the political change that Ashley is identifying is her kind of awareness of the persecutions that were happening in Russia and Eastern Europe that sent so many Jewish immigrants to the United States. But that's the big difference here. That's what happens between Echoes and the new Ezekiel. Why would finding out about all these immigrants prompt a poem like the new Ezekiel? It's a different kind of language. I mean, it's. Okay, I'm sorry. How are the poems different in the way that they sound? Just start there.
Well, Echoes is very kind of soft poem. It's timid almost in its language, but the new Ezekiel is very bold, and you get like these rhetorical questions and a call for these bones to rise up, and it's very passionate, I think. Why would her experience with the immigrants and her knowledge of the pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe call for this new kind of language, this new kind of approach in, let me rephrase that. It's very Old Testament-y, this new Ezekiel. It's an easier poem to read. It's more accessible. You do have to be knowledgeable. Well, all you have to know about is the Old Testament, right? Echoes is referring to its allusions are probably more complex, and so there's a way in which New Ezekiel is even a simpler poem. Why would, in a poet's development, she go from more complex to simple?
I didn't see it that way. I saw it that
Tell me.
maybe in Echoes, it wasn't necessarily that it was more complex. I thought that it was kind of like a throwback to Greek literature, and she's writing about nymphs and warriors, and she probably has in mind something like Troy, the time of Troy. But then later on, when she's that was for fun, maybe. And then later on, when she writes the new Ezekiel, it's kind of like a marching order. She's kind of saying, hey, America's here, we live here, and there's less persecution here, everyone should come here. And like you said, it seems biblical, and she's hearkening back to Moses leading the chosen people out to the Holy Land, and maybe she's saying, I can't lead you to the Holy Land, but I can urge you to come here, and we could build a new place.
I think that's a great way to talk about this shift. It's a shift from what you might call Hellenism, kind of Greek classical culture, the ancient Greeks, to Judaism. And she, as Ashley pointed out, she is a Jew, but the family's not particularly devout or religious. They're part of the synagogue, but it's not a big part of their life at all. But this rhetoric actually shifts into what seems to be a very devout kind of Judaism. How would you describe the Judaism of the new Ezekiel? If the first poem is Hellenistic and this is Judaic, what is Judaic in terms of the style, the ideas? Does that make sense? Cameron?
I think just the whole idea of the hope of the restoration, that's the major overriding theme of the whole Old Testament is you will be in exile, but I will restore a remnant, but I will bring you back, but I will redeem you type idea. And this is the time to remind people of that restoration because they need it, and this time. And that's when you pull out this kind of language. Remember, God will step in, He will intervene, and He will restore. He has promised that. The promises live just like the bones, are resurrected.
I was just going to talk about the language, the biblical language in the New Ezekiel. You get the psalmist, priest, and prophets. She talks about the house of Israel. That first line in the second stanza, yea, prophecy, the Lord hath said, again, and just like that, the word hath, that harkens to biblical language, the King James Version of the Bible.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right that you talked about it in terms of hope. But it's this, you can also see it in terms of faith, right? The Jewish people are called upon to be faithful to God, even though everything seems to be going bad. Like you think of the book of Job, right? Or think about Abraham, who's told to go sacrifice his own son, and he needs to continue to be faithful. The Jewish people are people of faith. But also, despite all the trials and tribulations, they are the chosen people, in a way that they're kind of superior to the Gentiles or the non-believers or the pagans, and that all comes across here too. There's something superior about this poem. I mean, she's calling upon the Lord to bring all the dead to life again, to create this new nation. That's scary, or exhilarating. Last poem before we kind of close up. Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking. What this poem is about probably depends on how you look at it. Is it a poem about art and poetry? Is it a poem about childhood? Is it a poem about death? Is it a poem about nature? Is it a poem about the ocean? Is it a poem about birds? What is it about? Real quickly, give me some, if you were to look at this from a 19th century perspective, Bronson Alcott's or Emerson's or William James's, what is this poem about? Start with Nick. What's this poem about?
Well, I looked at it from Bronson Alcott's point of view. I think he'd be really interested in how this all takes place with a child. And I think it was kind of believable, it has this ability to understand these birds, and how when we're children, according to the Socratic method, how you get closer to that divine being, that divine spirit. And then how this is kind of like this kid's first introduction to love, and he sees the bitterness of it, and then that has an effect on him later on, because then it's like, the last words of speaks about our death, and just talking about, it's very bitter and very negative, so I think how that, I don't know, I think Bronson would read it and like it. I think it works.
It's a poem about childhood, but also the development of the child, how the child begins to understand things.
And how he takes it in himself. I mean, he's not really on anybody, he's just listening to his word and then making his own assumptions and then.
Yeah.
And that's the main thing I think that he would like.
Yeah. The child, him or herself, is able to learn these things. You realize these things. You don't memorize. You don't go read books. You gradually come to a realization of things like love, death, the meaning of life, the meaning of the ocean, etc. Terrific. What else is this poem about if you took it from a different perspective?
We talked about taking it from Emma Lazarus' perspective and how in the poem this child comes to hear the voice of nature, but it's at a price. Like this bird dies, and it's a sad story, but he still learns something from it. He learns how to hear the voice of nature. So we thought that was kind of comparable to Emma Lazarus' views of the Jews, like how they were a very oppressed people, but out of their oppression they're going to have this new land, America, opened up to them. So
Excellent. It's a poem about the pain, how pain and sacrifice, yield up these great new gifts, and they don't come easily. That's excellent. They're both also very interested in the poet's voice. Like, where does poetry come from? How does a poet begin to be a poet? Other takes on this poem? How would Louisa May Alcott see this, or Emerson?
I looked at it from Louisa May Alcott's point of view, and certainly the child. She writes a lot about children. The child would jump out at her, and how the child is intelligent. The child certainly isn't presented as childlike necessarily.
How is the kid in this poem similar to or different from Joe and Meg and Beth and Amy and Lori? Are there any similarities?
See, I wrote about this poem, and I always think of this child as very smart and knowing how to be in nature, be open to nature, learn from nature. And the Little Women I always think of as domestic, so if I got them outside.
Who's the most outdoorsy of the girls?
Yeah,
Yeah?
I was just thinking of Beth and her solitude and her ability to take, I think she would also be more open to taking in, like stepping back and taking in the nature and taking in the experience, whereas Joe may be too caught up in jumping in the mud puddle.
Jumping into the ocean.
Yeah.
This is a melancholic boy. Joe has the blues, but she's kind of a perky, happy person. Beth is seriously melancholic and interior. And I mean, I hadn't thought about that, but that's a really interesting. And I remember our discussion of this. You were all like, "Well, no, Beth is a really interesting character. She's an interior character, and you just don't see what's going on in her."
I was going to mention the seaside scene with her and Joe on the shore, and she's watching the little birds, and that kind of reminded me of Out of the Cradle a little bit, because she draws this analogy between her sisters and the birds, and gives some meaning from the birds, just like the child and the Whitman poem does.
Whitman, the boy, and all the little March girls, they're all transcendentalists in a sense. I mean, it's amazing how much influence this. It was like a failed religion almost, right? You read nature, and it sounds like it's almost going to be. This is going to be the new way to approach religion. But if it's all about individualism, like nobody's going to go to church, right? Nobody's going to contribute or anything like that. And especially after Emerson and Thoreau's kind of anti-philanthropic attitude. So it fails as a religion, but it has all this influence and all of these other American literary texts. Whitman and Louisa May Alcott, for example. Just to tie up a couple of things. Of these 5 texts that we read today, which do you think was the most important for the 19th century? The one that mattered the most, that had the most impact, that had the most influence on its own culture and its own time, and why? I don't expect you to agree about this, but which one do you think it is?
I'll just throw the Frederick Douglass out there because when we think about the 19th century, the Civil War is one of the first things that popped up, and he was dealing directly with it in slavery.
He is right in the thick of the anti-slavery struggle that leads eventually to the Civil War, which transforms the century. And he's clearly, with perhaps Garrison, he and Garrison are the two most important anti-slavery folks. And Douglass is the more gifted as a speaker and a thinker.
Are you asking what has significance now?
No, that's my next question,
Okay.
which is, which one matters to us most now?
I'm just going to throw Whitman out there. In light of literature, when he did change the face of poetry, he changed poetry. So I'm going to throw Whitman out there.
No, and so if you look at it politically, in terms of the war and everything that slavery did to society and how the war and everything after changed society, maybe it's Douglass. If you think about it in terms of literary history, what Whitman did to poetry was as we discussed, monumental. Excellent. Those are both terrific answers. Other thoughts?
I was thinking of Douglass or Fuller because both of them have, well, I guess Douglass's ideas weren't as new, but Margaret Fuller in her advocacy for women, that was a pretty new idea for the 19th century, I think, and just her support of that.
She writes this in the early 1840s. She publishes it as a book in 1845, and the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention is 1848. And so, yeah, it comes before the women's movement really gets started, and it's influential. How about now? Which of these texts matter to us most now, and why?
Well, in literature, and I love poetry, so I'd have to go with Whitman for now, because I hear about him all the time. He's influenced many poets, and has a lot of, I guess you say, he's caused a lot of bad poetry to be written, but he's influenced a lot of people nevertheless.
What's the difference between Whitman and the bad poetry that's written now that seems to have proceeded from Whitman?
Because I think every poet has their person they want to be Whitman. Every poet, good or bad, trained or just writing in their kitchen, wants to be Whitman. And you have to wrestle with that, and that's where bad poetry comes from. It's that voice.
That they're trying to be somebody that they're not, that he is.
Yes, and that I would, yeah.
Levi? Michelle?
That, and then they hear the word free verse and think all rules are out the window, so they just ramble on, write a few words and think it's poetry.
I know you all know this, but yeah, he gets rid of the end rhyme, he gets rid of regular meter, but rhythm and sound and pattern, so sound, are tremendously important, as you know, to Whitman. And so when people just start writing free verse thinking, oh, I'll just write what comes into my head and call that poetry, it's not. It's not at all.
I was going to go with what Terry said. Whitman would want you to be yourself while you're writing poetry and not try to capture his voice. So I think that's a big difference between Whitman writing from his own voice and people trying to write from their own voice.
Yeah, they're imitative, which is, even if they're trying to do homage to his form, by doing so, they're really violating what he most wanted, which was for them to sing the song of themselves. Excellent. Other thoughts about?
I would say both Fuller and Douglass are the most important right now because we're still struggling for freedom in the world. We pretty much have it here in America, but other places, like in Afghanistan, women were just able to drive, just able to get a driver's license like 5 years ago or not very long ago. And there's still a lot of places where people can't even have the basic freedoms just because they're a woman or just because they're a different color.
Well, people are still enslaved, right?
Yeah.
It's not legal in the United States anymore, but people are still enslaved in various ways, as the Transcendentals would remind us. I'm just thinking back to slavery in Massachusetts, where Thoreau says we need to, fight slavery here in our own state. And people who would do whatever the slaveholders tell them to do, that they would be conformists. Other thoughts about? Okay, let's take a break, and when we come back, I have a few more concluding questions, and we'll dive into the review and finish